Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
And I think it's a theme that we find throughout black liberation theology. That is, that suffering is somehow redemptive, that death and cross lead to resurrection, that Good Friday moves us towards Easter in some inevitable kind of way because it's all in the hand of God.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Patricia Snapp, an associate professor of literature at Siena Heights College. Father Bacik and Sister Snapp will discuss black theology and the suffering Christ. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Pat, I know that you've been under a lot of pressure lately and are greatly fatigued. I hope that you're able to stay awake throughout this program and would converse with me a little bit about black theology. Of course, if you do nod off, I will just carry on, so you don't have to worry about it.
Fine.
But I do want to talk about black theology a bit, and since you wrote a dissertation making use of certain black theologians, I would like to pick your brains a little bit on that. Why don't we just mention, when we say that, I mean, the man who comes to my mind is James Cone, who teaches at Union Theological in New York, was there, I think, even when I went to school there years ago, and would be one of the leaders among the black theologians. You want to say anything about him or his thought or books or any of the black thinkers?
Well, James Cone would probably be the most popular, the best known, and the most prolific. I think Gabriel Wilmore has done a wonderful service in his book, Black Religion and Black Radicalism, in which he traces the continuum of themes from the antebellum period up to and through the formulation of black liberation theology in the 60s, 70s, and even into our own decade. And a fine thinker, very illuminating on some of the distinctiveness of black Christianity in the United States. But I think James Cone probably is most helpful, most concise, and as I said, most prolific in popularizing just what black theology is, where it came from, why it was formulated, giving its history, and so forth.
I think we're at a very beginning stage of that theology.
That's right, I think
and
so
always
too.
When that happens, you have a new movement. It's it's difficult to get a comprehensive sense of it early on. You have people doing bits and pieces of it, and ideas surfacing, and it begins to work its way into the journals, and before long you get sort of a cross-fertilization of ideas, and before long they'll be in dialogue with the African theologians, and have already done that to some degree, and then you'll get interest with the Asiatic liberation theologians. So it's all part of a growing field of theology, and it's one that I think that one senses beginnings, and that there's a long ways to go. And yet I feel that at this point there's an awful lot to be learned from these people. Clearly one of the major themes they keep putting before us is the Exodus theme, the great importance of God liberating his people from political and economic and social slavery in Egypt and giving them the promised land. There's a lot of drawing on the Hebrew scriptures, especially because of their earthiness, bodiliness, social, political character. In the Hebrew scriptures, it's very clear that God stands with the oppressed and is willing is working to try to liberate them. That's a theme that all liberation theology, of course, is very taken by. They're able to identify quickly with the oppressors in those stories. They begin to read the scriptures from the downside, from those of the underclass, and sort of enrich our understanding of all of that. I think it's very true also that black theology draws on the experience in the black churches, as people heard the preaching, and before the Civil War, very often the white preachers, and then later on the black preachers, who took over the services themselves, used sort of coded ways of telling the slaves that there would be freedom someday, a new Moses that would be raised up to lead them into the promised land. And so we had the whole black church experience has been an important part of that. And I want to sort of move beyond all of that now and to move into the more of the distinctively Christian themes, one of which would be redemptive suffering. Redemptive suffering would be an important part of what works its way into black theology. So do you want to begin to comment a bit on that, or to pick up any of the earlier things?
Okay, I'd like to pick up on an earlier thing you said, because maybe we need a bit of a bridge. We haven't really talked much about power. Now, how power figures into... Power was a concept that, in a sense, led to the initial formulation of Black liberation theology. And I suppose we would associate power more with the whole sense of the Exodus, people coming into their own, being freed from enslavement. And maybe just a little bit of the history of Black liberation theology might be in order here.
I would like to hear that myself.
Well, Stokely Carmichael, during the Civil Rights Movement, began to popularize the concept of Black power. And it seemed abrasive to many people, and Martin Luther King himself was troubled by it and by the somewhat militant nature of Carmichael's pronouncements.
Right, he tried to talk him out of using the phrase.
Yes, he did, as a matter of fact, yes. But there was a small group of what might be considered radical Black clergy who felt that Stokely Carmichael was not talking about anything wrong, but simply about the needed solidarity of people who are oppressed if they are going to in any way claim that power which by rights should be theirs, and sort of reflecting on their own minority status in terms of power positions within often the white churches to which they belonged. And so they wrote a Black power statement in which they were supportive of Stokely Carmichael's concepts. And they received very, very little encouragement from the white church establishment. And for some time had not received any encouragement in all of the work of the civil rights movement. So they began to look back at their own history for some theological basis for seeing power as a concept that somehow was sanctioned by their own spiritual journey. And they seized upon the Exodus event, but they also found in the early Black Christian church in the United States a focusing in on liberation themes, which they then sort of retrieved from their own early history and began to make use of again. And in the course of writing out what was called a Black Power Statement, which was their own way of vindicating, I guess, Stokely Carmichael's use of and advocacy of the term Black Power, they called the white churches morally bankrupt and said many things which were highly abrasive, and began that separation, which led eventually to the formulation, the beginnings, I suppose, the firstlings of the formulation of what has become a distinctive approach to theology, a distinctive way of doing theology. So it began, in a sense, as a condemnation of the maybe wimpiness of the white churches at the time that the civil rights movement was underway, for their lack of support, for their lack of what shall I say, solidarity with Black Christians in this struggle for achieving their own civil rights.
Well, you get that same notion in Martin Luther King in his letter from Birmingham City Jail, where he chides the white churches for not joining in the struggle for liberation, and they keep telling him wait and so on, and he says, we can't wait forever. Now is the time, and now is the time to respond to the gospel. And he did it in language that they probably could understand, since he ended up quoting the great theologians in history and religious thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas and Paul Tillich and so on, and Reinhold Niebuhr, figures that those leaders in the white churches would recognize. And out of that long history and tradition, he tried to help them to see that it wasn't right to just sit by and to use Thomas Merton phrase, the conjectures of the guilty bystander, that it wasn't good enough to do that. So he out of his own stance, made the same sort of charge. And of course, I think his positions were always more moderate, I suppose, than Stokely Carmichael's. I mean, eventually they came to work out some accommodations, I think, and so on. But so that it wasn't just what you would refer to as the radical wing of the movement that made that charge, but certainly it came from the very center and from the moderate element as well.
Okay, good point. So what we have then in the origins of Black liberation theology is, in a sense, what becomes almost a blending of much of Martin Luther King's own religious thought and perhaps the somewhat more militant demands from people such as Stokely Carmichael for power, only this time it was for power within the churches. And it was also even accommodating to some of the concepts of Malcolm X. And so there was from the beginning, at least on the part of Cone and some of the Black liberation theologians, a tone of militancy that was missing from Martin Luther King, and yet at the same time an embracing of much of the religious thought and the insights of Martin Luther King.
Let me just pick up on Malcolm X for a minute, because I think he's an important figure in this whole history as well. And we recall that Malcolm X was in prison and sort of took on a militant Muslim kind of religion and talked about all whites as devils and saw them as nothing but the opponents. And later on got out of jail and was able to visit the holy Muslim shrines, and in doing so underwent a great conversion experience, a tremendous conversion in which he saw people of all races at the holy places, and was able to say, well, it can't be that the whites are nothing but devils. And so he revised his thinking and saw there needed to be a sense of solidarity. In fact, he came down to visit Martin Luther King when he was in prison one time, I think, looking for reconciliation with him. And it wasn't long after that he himself was assassinated then. So Malcolm X was an interesting story in his whole conversion experience, which moved him towards greater sense of reconciliation and a more universal outlook on how we were going to get together. So well, anyway, he's an important part in this story of the development of the Black theology. What's interesting to note about this is how Black theology is so much involved in the story, as you well put it, of Black power and the Black struggle for liberation. What is clear in Black theology is that you can't do it in the abstract. You don't do it in an ivory tower. All these people we're talking about are deeply involved in the civil rights movement. And
That's right.
They're doing their theology as they're marching along and as they're sitting in jail. And it has a very different flavor. I mean, some people would want to claim that someone like Martin Luther King, for example, was not really a theologian. As a matter of fact, I like to list him as a theologian. First of all, he had a great background in it, and he did a doctorate in theology at Boston University, and comparing the thought of Tillich and Wyman, and so he was very accomplished. In fact, at one time he wanted to be a theology professor, and I think he could have done it. But he was propelled by events into being an activist and playing a leadership role. So he did his theology as he went along. He periodically reflected on what was happening, or you could put it the other way, his actions, his choices gave us a sense of how he saw the gospel. Well, let me just take up one element of that, which I had said before I wanted to get to, and that was the whole redemptive suffering notion and how he played that out rather consistently in his own life. I'm thinking about when his own house was firebombed and his wife and his daughter, in that case, Yolanda, were under great pressure and threats and so on. And his response was not to retaliate in kind, not to respond violently, but to do so nonviolently. And one could see in his mind, I think, the example of Jesus Christ, who said, put away the sword. You take up the sword, you'll perish by the sword. The Jesus who refused to join the zealot party and to look for military means of overthrowing the Roman occupiers. Jesus who insisted on turning the other cheek and taught us, blessed are the peacemakers. So we see the example of Christ, I think, here at work in the life and the sermons and the writings of Martin Luther King. And I think it's a theme that we find throughout Black liberation theology. That is, that suffering is somehow redemptive, that death and cross lead to resurrection, that Good Friday moves us towards Easter in some inevitable kind of way because it's all in the hand of God. Wish I could remember now some of the phrases Martin Luther King used to say that, but that the long arm of history eventually writes it correctly. It's eventually the power and goodness of God triumphs over all of the oppression and the evil in the world. But anyway, do you want to pick up on that redemptive suffering theme there, the suffering Christ image and so on among the black thinkers?
Yeah, Gabriel Wilmore, I think, speaks about it more than I'm remembering that James Cone does. But that, for blacks coming together to worship, the part of the New Testament with which they would be most familiar and which would be focused on more than anything else would be precisely the sufferings of Christ, because they would be the part with which blacks could identify. Again, the sense of Baldwin that, when a black quotes the Bible, he's telling you what happened to him today. Baldwin makes the same point also, that blacks might be a lot less familiar with or eager to talk about the miracles of Christ or the other preachings of Christ, but would heavily focus in on and tend to preach about, and this comes through in black literature also, whenever black religious experience or tent meetings or church meetings are being told about, that the focus would be on the suffering Christ, because it would be the suffering Christ with which the average black American, black Christian could most identify, but it was a suffering which ended triumphantly. Mm-hmm. And so there would be this sense of, again, it would feed the hope that somehow all of this suffering will somehow, the tears will be wiped away, it will all be vindicated. If it is endured as Christ endured his sufferings, we too will come to glory, we will come to triumph. Mm-hmm. And we think of the importance of the word glory in black services, for instance. The importance of the reminding of the sense of heaven, I think in a way much more prominent than probably in white churches generally.
Let's go back over some of that. When you talk about the sufferings of Christ, I take it that it is the physical sufferings, the passion and so on, Lord that they zero in on.
A lot humiliations.
Of us, when we think of the sufferings of Christ, I mean, there could be a broad-based way of seeing that. I mean, a lot of the sufferings of Christ are perhaps more subtle and psychological, the ones of being rejected by his own people, for example, or and not being understood by the religious establishment, or perhaps the disappointments he had in dealing with his own family. As we get it in Mark's gospel, the family doesn't understand him. They want to get him back home. The hint in Mark's gospel that his mother doesn't understand him, and that she's among those who out there and thinking that maybe he's gone too far and needs to be reined in and brought back home. So, I mean, there's a whole range of sufferings. One of our key theological points is that Jesus Christ was like us in all things except sin, which means he would have experienced all of the vicissitudes of human existence and all of the disappointments and troubles and anxieties and so on. So that is a broad-based kind of idea to say that, we talk about the sufferings of Jesus. I suppose every group of people who would read the New Testament would find their own sense of suffering in Jesus. For some, it would probably be more subtle, more psychological. For others, more physical and zeroed in on the passion itself. And I take it that for the black experience, the slaves in the South undergoing such great physical difficulties. Although maybe I'm off the track on that a little bit, because obviously to be in a slave position, is to have tremendous psychological damage done. It's to be inflicted in all parts of one's being. So I guess I would have to try to remember that. I'm trying to get at, I guess the question is, which part of it did they emphasize? Do you know that in their own preaching?
I would say it would be the part that we emphasize in Lent. That is what we call Passion Tide. Yeah. And it would be the physical sufferings, the rejection, betrayal, being spat upon, mocked, ridiculed, scourging,
surely
etc.
that, yes.
And many of the black poets, for instance, in referring to lynchings, will have an implicit comparison with Christ hanging from the tree, for instance.
Really?
But you think of one of the great spirituals, "Were You There When They Crucified My Lord?" Which wasn't sung only in Lent or on Good Friday, but a very common hymn, again, looking at Jesus suffering, Jesus done in by his countrymen. But with the sense that he will triumphantly.
Yeah, that's the other point that you made so well, I think, is about glory, and that from our viewpoint we always talk about the paschal mystery, that you have to see it whole, that if you talk about the death of Jesus in isolation or the resurrection in isolation, you miss the real essential link that we find in the Christian message and in the life of Jesus. It's precisely the putting together of the two that helps us to deal with life, that it is out of death that comes the triumph. The death and suffering is itself redemptive somehow in God's plan. That is, quite a remarkable notion if we step back and think about it. It's so opposed to the way we often feel about life or want it to be. But suffering is inevitable. One has to take up a stance towards it, and of course what the Christian says is, no, it brings good, that unless the seed falls into the ground and dies, it cannot bear fruit. And therefore we see that exemplified in the life of Jesus. He goes to Jerusalem knowing his fate or suspecting it strongly, goes there anyway out of obedience to his Father, thinks that he must follow out the will of the one he calls Abba, and in doing so, is taken to his death, executed as a rebel, and so on. Another theme that I could play into this black theology, I would think. And then it comes the resurrection and the glory, and you suggested that the great importance that the word glory plays in the black experience. Do you want to say anything more about that?
No, I don't. But what I want to point out is that there's this interesting dichotomy, almost conflict between reflecting on, absorbing, if you will, the spiritual strength from focusing on the suffering Christ, which is the sort of reflection or meditation that may well enable us to accept our own sufferings, the sufferings of our life, with patience and with hope that they will have some sort of ultimate meaning and purpose and bring me to God and bring me to glory. And at the same time, the whole theme of the need to work for liberation, that liberation, as Martin Luther King well said, is not going to be granted by the oppressors, that it will have to be struggled for, that there will have to be an active involvement on the part of those who are oppressed, and that there's a kind of conflict there, and it's rooted, I suppose, in the whole sense that was expressed by Marx, that religion can be, he said, is the opium of the people, that it can lead to passivity. Yeah. And so we see both of these elements, both of them strong in black religion, one which seems to counsel patience and acceptance, the other of which seems to say God is on the side of the oppressed, he is leading you to freedom, and that sort of becomes the incentive for taking part in the struggle, being willing to put one's body on the line and not simply passively accept the circumstances of one's life.
I find that exemplified again in Martin Luther King, who I think is one of our fine black theologians. I want to make sure he stays in the picture in a way, because I think
You're doing it very well, Jim.
I think he has a richness of thought. I meant it in a broader sense, a richness of thought that the other black theologians should not lose sight of. It really disturbs me that in much of the liberation literature that Martin Luther King is not mentioned, because
right.
I think he had a depth that others don't have. He had a consistent sense of nonviolence that really ought to be kept in mind, and it flowed for him out of a deep religious experience. There's an experience that often is called the kitchen experience, that after great difficulties he was having in his life, and late at night, and he was feeling really down and depressed, and he wanted to give up this whole civil rights movement. He went down to his kitchen and he was making some coffee, and it was really late at night, and as he reports it, he heard at that point an inner voice And the inner voice said something like to him, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you, even unto the end of the world. And King, in reflecting on that, he understood that as the voice of Jesus, telling him that he would be with him in this struggle for freedom. And that, I think, exemplifies the point that you're making before. There was a way in which the black theology is a catalyst for action. I think it's very ambivalent. In other words, there's part of it that would say, the black church experience said, put up with this slavery, go through it, and so on, be passive. The whites used it that way. Sometimes the black preachers used it that way, I think.
That's right.
But on the other hand, you have this marvelous active sense, lo, I'll be with you, even unto the end of the world. Therefore, stay in the civil rights struggle. And Martin Luther said he never lost that experience. He carried that with him. Jesus was at his side, the suffering Christ who knew so well what his people were going through. Here is working with him. And that's a great sense of hope. And it really did sustain him throughout many of the struggles that he had to go through.
Gabriel Wilmore talks about what he calls the period of the de-radicalization of the black church, which he saw as happening after the Emancipation Proclamation, really, and up almost until the Civil Rights Movement. That prior to that time, there was a heavy focus on liberation themes. The black church often, fed this hope and even was the instigator, the seedbed of various revolts. But then at the time of the emancipation, blacks simply, for a while, lived with the hope that somehow they had arrived in the promised land, things would go well. And then there was the black leader Booker T. Washington, who counseled a sort of a go slow policy and an accommodation to whites who weren't entirely ready to hand over all the freedoms that blacks thought that they had just been given. And at the same time, there were a number, apparently, of white evangelists who were preaching the passive, docile Christ who accepted his sufferings and often imitated that preaching. But that, in a sense, this period has been sandwiched between a different focus.
Right, and what we see now is, of course, the raising up in strong, decisive ways of these liberation themes. The Exodus as being a source of hope for the people, and especially, as we've been trying to stress here, the redemptive power of suffering. The black people who went through so much and the terrible experience of slavery, the continuing kinds of difficulties they have. And out of that, especially looking at Jesus Christ saying, still here is a message of hope. There is the possibility of liberation for all of us.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Sister Patricia Snapp, who is an associate professor of literature at Siena Heights College. The topic of this week's Reflections was Black Theology and the Suffering Christ. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.